here, and hopefully she'll be able to join us here momentarily. I do not see her in the attendee list.
Okay,
well, welcome back, everybody. That was a dynamic first session. Like I said, we try to pose any number of questions and discussions for everyone's education. And, like I said before with my little disclaimer, PCL is not taking formal positions on everything unless stated so in the session. And I'm sure that this conversation about nuclear will continue as it's starting to become a quote hotter topic. So, all right, we're going to get started here in our second session today. Little setup for this panel: wildfire evacuation planning and project siting and design. Is that PCL and others, many of our partners and ally stakeholder groups, have been engaged in this challenging topic and issue for decades. And I know that the panelists will be diving into some of that in the discussion, so I'll let them divulge the details of what we're trying to tackle here now. But I'm get started here with introducing our coordinator and our moderator, Kevin Johnson. He is a PCL board vice president and chair of the PCL policy committee. And I'm very much looking to this conversation today. You guys, this little team here has been doing some heavy lifting for a while. So I'll let you take it away, Kevin. Thanks so much.
Howard, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited about this group here we have today. We've been working together as a team for over 3 months, meeting regularly and developing draft legislation to address these wildfire issues. I just got word today that we were authorized to report that Senator Ben Allen, whose office has been looking at our draft legislation, which we're going to be going through today in some detail, with the eye of actually having the matter introduced as a bill for the senator. So when we started this project, our goal was, let's get some really important stuff done. Let's get it adopted into law, and so far so good. Now, I want to add a disclaimer. When we got the group together, it was understood that nobody was taking a position about whether it was a good or a bad idea to be building in high-risk wildfire areas. Basically, what you're going to hear about is what the group collectively, and I should mention our policy director for PCL, Matt Baker, has been involved in this regular meeting sequence also. But basically, if you're going to build in these areas, then here's what you need to do in terms of looking at the wildfire evacuation issues. And I will note that Senator Allen's staff, when they first saw this, they read our proposal and they said, I can't believe that all this stuff is not in law already. And what we're looking to do is fill a very important gap here in terms of what's going on statewide. So let me introduce our first panelist. Bob Roper is a former Ventura County Fire Chief and current co-chair of the California Fire Safe Council. Bob has over 36 years experience as a firefighter, including 14 years as the Ventura County Fire Chief. He has been chair of the International Association of Fire Chiefs Wildland Fire Policy Committee. This forum required a global viewpoint of the nation's wildland fire problem and interaction with National Association of State Foresters, federal partners, and the international wildfire community. He is currently the policy advisor for the Western Fire Chiefs Association and the co-chair for the California Fire Safe Council. He was recently appointed to the National Commission on National Wildfire Issues, and I know he's been very busy working on that. We've appreciated him finding time for our working group. So Bob, let me hand it over to you, and you can explain what our goals have been in terms of this working group.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kevin. The primary goal of our effort was to create some uniform or standard evacuation planning process that needs to be considered during a development approval process. Like Kevin said, we have bits and pieces, but not uniform. So we usually have some issues along the way. Overall, the scope and the quality of evacuation plan projects in the high risk or the very high risk severity zones have widely varied across the state. The inadequate plans and their lack of clear and meaningful performance has often prevented lead agencies from making informed decisions, and wildfire related measures, including a number of ingress and egress roads. Some of the other things that we've been looking at are the current evacuations are not specifically addressed in the recent Board of Forestry fire safe regs. There's also been a wide variety of issues around the state, both in scope and quality of the evacuation planning, and this is due to the lack of uniformity. We've had some deficiencies in the planning that has led to uninformed decisions on projects and project design, and usually these come up in after the fact through the CEQA process. We also need to avoid interfering with evacuations from surrounding communities. What this means is we have a new project that goes into an area and we consider the evacuation of that area, but do we really consider that impact on an existing community that those streets and the people are going out in? We also need to identify and plan for the use of safe haven areas. These are areas, whether they're the temporary refuge areas or the true safe haven areas where the public, if they can't get out, they can be protected. We also need to fully involve our law enforcement partners along with the fire authorities in the planning and approval process. Too often times, our law enforcement partners just are taking recommendations of the fire authority when an incident occurs, but then they're left there trying to actually direct the traffic, get people out. And so this needs to be a joint process along the way. We also need a clear explanation of the respective roles and make things work toward the future. We also have to avoid the litigation over deficient plans after the fact. That slows good projects down. And our overall goal is to standardize evacuation planning, including meaningful performance criteria. Right now, that's the one area that we have for evacuation planning, is we may dictate that they need to have multiple roads this or out, but there's no criteria that says how fast should we get somebody out of an area. And we'll be going into these other areas in more details with the other speakers. Back to you, Kevin.
Bob, thank you very much. We've had some technical difficulties in connecting Laura Blau to this panel discussion. We're trying to work with a phone number in terms of getting her connected, but we're in a standby mode on that with a report pending from our technical people. So I'm going to ask if Mike could step in and cover Laura's points. We're going to be going sort of paragraph by paragraph in terms of the legislation. So you'll hear us moving quickly from one speaker to another. But let me first introduce Mike to everyone. And Mike has just amazing experience. He's been, like Bob and everyone else, just a wonderful contributor to this effort. He is the current CEO and principal consultant of Rohde and Associates. He's been a professional in this discipline for more than 45 years. He retired from 37 years active duty in the fire service as a battalion chief with the Orange County Fire Authority, and had previous work experience with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Los Angeles County Fire Department. His experience has included positions in operations, executive staffing, strategic planning, fire prevention, hazardous materials and training, and he is nationally qualified as an incident commander, operations and planning section chief, structural protection specialist, and hazardous materials specialist, including service with state and federal type 1 incident management teams in the management of wildfires and incidents of national significance. As a consultant, he has provided services to both Fortune 500 companies and government, providing emergency and disaster planning. He's also the author of a seminal study in the command of major wildland urban interface incidents, entitled Command Decisions During Catastrophic Interface Wildfire. With that, Mike, please explain the first part of our legislative proposal.
Thank you, Kevin, and good morning. The area of focus of our proposed evacuation legislation affects areas within the state of California designated currently as state responsibility area wildlands. Those are typically watershed areas of the state, and local responsibility areas, those within incorporated cities that are designated by state statute as either high or very high fire hazard severity zone. And this would include both projects that are situated within those specific zones and for projects transversing those zones, like their evacuation routing or what have you would cross those kinds of designations. These areas are currently being modified in California, especially the high, very high fire hazard severity zones. CAL FIRE has just recently completed new mapping of the state and has expanded those areas and has those maps out now for consideration by the public and for public hearing. But does, I think, expand statewide the highest category, the very high zones, by about 20%. And that's a reflection, according to CAL FIRE, as a result of climate change and wildfire frequency. So the kinds of things that we're looking at in the legislation is twofold. One is evacuation planning in and of itself. Amazingly enough, as Kevin already stressed, while construction of communities to fire safe standards have been in law for some time, the evacuation planning and requirements for that within the state is rather piecemeal. It goes different county to different county, what's enforced, and no statewide standard exists for how that work is to be conducted. So emergency evacuation is one portion of that, but at the same token, there are occasions and instances where evacuations will not be successful as a result of where the fire originated, perhaps, when the fire maybe originates too close to a community to allow for effective evacuation, or it may compromise perhaps the evacuation routes themselves. In those cases, we have to propose within communities themselves enough hardening and enough area within the community that they can safely house through temporary refuge areas, populations that may be trapped within the community. This was demonstrated, by the way, in its importance by the 2017 Camp Fire in the community of Paradise, California, one of the most significant structural loss and life loss fires in the state's history. Over 8,000 residents in the attempt to evacuate were cut off by the fire's movement and were forced into areas that would be categorized as temporary safe refuge, places like large parking lots, parks, baseball diamonds, and things like that, where they had some distance and safety from fire effects. Having those within the community as an alternative to evacuation is, we believe, reasonable and important. So the last thing we want to talk about in this particular paragraph is, or this portion of the study, is that there are a couple of means of achieving these changes. One is adoption in statewide fire codes, but a more prominent, perhaps, way to do this is through adoption in the CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act process itself. All new development in California is challenged to go through this process. And in 2020, CEQA was modified to include studies of fire safety as a requirement. We'd like to see evacuation added to that component so that it becomes an element of every project studied in the state. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. Let me turn it over to Bob now to talk about our next section.
Okay. In this section, what we want to ensure that the emergency plan and the temporary refuge areas are consistent with the county's emergency plan. This is important information just to make sure that we have continuity of operations between all parties. We also want to make sure there's a joint review and independent approval by the respective law enforcement and fire agencies that have jurisdictional authority. This is important because of those law enforcement and fire agencies are going to be the ones actually out there during the emergencies, and they'll have the information. What we also want to try to do is transition the information that is submitted during the planning process, and that data is maintained so it's actually used during an actual emergency. Currently today, a lot of those things are approved during the development process, but they're lost over the years. And so fire and law are usually implementing new practices at the scene of the emergency. We also want to have a detailed explanation of the respective roles of law enforcement and the fire agencies during the planning process, so everybody understands that. And a consideration of staffing in multiple fire events that are impacting the area. What this means is usually, especially during wildfires, if we have one event and then another, is there enough staff from fire and law to be able to actually implement the evacuation plans? And then lastly, we want to ensure, as we talk about law enforcement and fire agencies, that usually deals with either the city or county entities, but often the California Highway Patrol has the legal authority over the unincorporated roads and or state highways, but oftentimes they're not involved in the planning process at all. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Bob. Our next speaker is Charlie Crocker, and he's the co-founder and CEO of Zonehaven. His current responsibilities include scaling for world's leading comprehensive critical communication platform that includes evacuation management, multi-channel geo-targeted alerting, and LRAD, long-range voice broadcast systems. He is a data geek and entrepreneur with more than 25 years of experience building teams to bring data out of the shadows and drive business value. Prior to Zonehaven, he built Autodesk's first big data platform team to support migration to subscription and the cloud. He also led product management for Autodesk flagship AutoCAD product line. Prior to Autodesk, he was co-founder in a startup focused on spatial databases and web-based tools for state and local government agencies and utility companies. Charlie Adzi has a passion for growing young leaders. He mentors MBA and MSBA students at UC Davis and California College of the Arts. So your turn, Charlie.
All right. Well, thank you. Really happy to be part of this esteemed group. So really thinking of it from both the tech perspective, but also from the experience that we've had over the last few years working with folks across California, really in the trenches doing the evacuations. It's been great to hear and see how this is going to help affect developments in the future. So one of the key things that we've been talking about is that when a new development is being planned, we have to look at both the ingress and egress. So what this means is identifying the best available egress routes for people that will be leaving that subdivision or that new area. And this is really has to be thought about in a regional context. So those roads will be connecting to roads that already exist and maybe impacting downstream. In addition, ingress, if first responders, emergency vehicles need to get into an area, are they going to be expected to use the exact same route to get in? Is that route going to be wide enough, et cetera? So new developments need to think about the impact and to engineer how to at least maintain or ideally improve on the regional traffic capacity for these subdivisions. And then in the planning as well, we spoke earlier, Mike and Bob spoke of the temporary refuge areas or the safe refuge areas. Where are these places in a new development? If this new development doesn't have a school in it, or does not have an area with a large parking lot, or does not have potentially like golf course or large open areas, what are the locations in case the egress points are unsafe for people to use? So we've seen recently with the atmospheric rivers that just hit California, a lot of mudslides, debris flows, trees down. Same thing happens during a fire. What is the opportunity, or what is the way people are going to get out in that case? So so really focusing once again on making sure we have the ingress and the egress, how it integrates with the regional solution, and then making sure that there are temporary refuge areas within that area in case of unsafe. So pass it back to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Really appreciate it. So we're still having technical problems with connecting Laura Blau to this panel. She reports that she doesn't have internet access. We've been trying to work with the phone, but we haven't been successful. At this point, I'm going to ask Bob to step in and talk about.
Laura has joined us.
Oh, she has. Laura, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Well, let me.
Oh, great. Sorry about that.
Let me briefly introduce you here before. And you're just in time to talk about paragraph 5. And Laura, everyone, has over 28 years of firefighting experience with the Orange County Fire Authority. She started as a paid call firefighter with that entity, and then rose to assistant chief and fire marshal. As fire marshal, she established the pre-fire management section to concentrate efforts on wildfire prevention and mitigation. She also worked with Bob Roper and Ventura County Fire to create the first pilot program for the Ready, Set, Grow program, which is, I understand, is used pretty much around the state now. Laura currently serves as the board secretary and is on the board of directors for the California Fire Safe Council, a statewide nonprofit with a mission to eliminate destructive wildfires. So Laura, please proceed.
Well, good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the temporary refuge areas and where they can be located, what they look like, where they are, and how they're designed. So what they are is any area with sufficient size and capacity to avoid life-threatening exposure, and that's both smoke and radiant heat. And then where they are, they can be any large pool, park, public park, any field without grasses or anything that can burn, and it can be even off-road parking. So you have to have accessibility within the development. You have to have enough parking so you're not blocking the roads in or out while you're in that safe refuge area. They are there to help both people who can't evacuate, people who refuse to, and then sometimes they panic and they leave a little bit late. They become trapped, and especially vulnerable populations. And you know, most of our wildfires, the people who perish in wildfires are almost always disabled or elderly. Of those that perished in the Camp Fire in Northern California, most were 60 years and older with limited mobility. They required assistive devices like walkers, wheelchairs, or oxygen. The 2017 fire in Napa, Sonoma, the average age of those that passed away were 73. So it's really important to do your education and engagement and get social services involved in training and to-go kits and maybe a registry. There are about 29 million Americans that are living in our high fire hazard areas, and about 12 million are considered socially vulnerable. So it's extremely important to have those safe areas in case people can't get out. Thank you.
So did you just turn it over?
You guys hear me?
I couldn't hear.
You know what? I will say one more thing. There are structures, so it doesn't just have to be. Charlie was talking about all the open space, and sometimes that's difficult. There are new codes that apply to anything constructed in one of our very high fire hazard severity zones or anything in the SRA, and it requires them to be ember and flame resistant. So a lot of times there'll be a structure or structures that have good defensible space around them that can also be used for people who can't evacuate.
Okay, very good.
Okay, back to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Laura. Glad you were able to get on here. Bob, can you tell us about paragraph 6?
Sure. And the next part, we would just want to address about evacuation planning using existing roads or sites for potential safe refuge areas. Where this is really important is that we want all ingress and egress access points to be part of the normal traffic circulation. Today, we have many secondary access that are out there that are sometimes overgrown with vegetation, are not readily used. So when an emergency happens, people don't really know where to go. You could live in a development with that secondary access and never be used to it unless you just happen to be walking by and seeing some of the signage if it's still there. The other part is we want to make sure that that ingress and egress does not require special knowledge or assistance. What we found is over a period of time is some of the secondary access have gates that have locks, and they should have Knox locks, which are special keyed for emergency responders. But again, you have to have special knowledge to open that. If the emergency responders cannot unlock those gates, the gates are useless. So why have a secondary access? So in this area, we want to make sure that traffic circulation is widely known by the public and it doesn't require special knowledge. Back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Bob. All right. So back to Mike this time to talk to us about our next section.
Thank you, Kevin. We'd like to see some statewide standards applied to evacuation studies that bring these studies to the best professional standard available today. There's a wide variety of opinion and practice currently implemented around the state on how any kind of evacuation plan is developed or brought forward for public consideration. The elements of design and execution of the plan, we believe, require a couple of professional levels of study. The first is that a wildfire behavior analysis using modern tools and capabilities for fire modeling that include a history of fire weather and historic fire behavior within the region need to be applied to the evacuation question, just like we use these same models for predicting fire behavior in major fires. These tools in that case then would give us the likely trajectory of a fire, the likely fire intensity, the distances ahead where spotting may be occurring, and other factors which would be critical to determining which routes might be safest to channel evacuees in their traffic out of an evacuation area, or more importantly, would inform public safety officials when they have to stop evacuating and shelter in place instead, because evacuation routes will be compromised and no longer safe for travel. Like the wildfire behavior studies, we believe also that a traffic engineering study by a certified traffic engineer is important to look at the regional traffic patterns that will be impacted by proposed development. Oftentimes, we find that proponents of new development offer traffic improvements, but they're very limited in scope. They're usually within the perimeter of the development itself, or perhaps right on the edge of the development, but they often bring new impacts to existing traffic patterns that impact regional evacuation capacity and traffic flows without bringing improvements to those same routes. It's not infrequent, for instance, for a new development in very high fire hazard severity zone to be located in a fashion that it impacts regional evacuation patterns that may affect 20 miles distant from that development as far as the ability to move people on existing routes. And without traffic improvements, obviously there is direct impacts there. We believe these two studies are important to inform decision makers on the ability of the community to evacuate safely, not just the new community that would be brought forward from the development, but the existing community as well. We believe that new planned community development requires at least two routes of access and emergency egress. This is in case, of course, one of those routes is compromised. Now, there is probably an option for very small projects to be exempted from this kind of a study requirement, because if they can all get out one way in a very fast manner and without going through unreasonable hoops, then that may be acceptable. But setting some kind of standards for when a second route is necessary is important, we believe, to this legislation. And we believe that that route must be a full-time accessible route. It can't have locked gates that will be unlocked by some custodian at the moment of need. It can't be a dirt road that goes back through a deep canyon, exposing evacuees to even worse fire effects. Can't require any kind of third-party intervention. Users to access immediately and simultaneously to an ordered evacuation. We think that these around an hour's period of time is a reasonable amount of time to evacuate most new development, and the capacity of traffic should be developed to allow that kind of occurrence. We already know that certain things don't work. And one of the things that we want to make sure that people don't consider, for instance, is a concept called contraflow. Now, I've already mentioned the fire that affected Paradise, California in 2017. A major problem there was that it's about 6.5, 7 miles from Paradise to Chico. And the evacuation was ordered to move the community residents from Paradise down into the valley, into Chico. And they used contraflow, where all lanes available paved were directed towards outbound traffic. That's usually a law enforcement intensive operation, because if you can imagine, all access points to a highway that's being used for opposite normal traffic must be controlled. Well, that was all right in this rural area for about the first 6 miles till they hit the town of Chico, where it hit a huge traffic jam and traffic started to back up. And unfortunately, a significant number of people perished in vehicles on the Skyway, which is the major access route to Chico, because they could not move in their vehicles when the fire moved across the highways. So contraflow, things like that should not be included in evacuation planning as a reasonable alternative unless they can prove the resources are immediately available to implement such an action. So with that, then back to you, Kevin.
So next up, we're back to Charlie, and he is going to talk about data preservation from the studies and how it can be used in emergency situations by the appropriate agencies.
All right, thanks. As Mike stated, there's a lot of analysis in preparation for understanding both the fire behavior as well as the potential traffic behavior and the loads onto the traffic network. Many counties right now across California have been adopting a variety of different evacuation plans and evacuation management systems. And often what you find is that the data and the analysis that gets created from these studies for these, it's done kind of as a one-off. And that information doesn't get passed to the managing authorities once the event is over. Or if it does, it gets handed off in a very static format. It's a 3-ring binder that gets put on a shelf. And so we're recommending here that the data and analyses that are collected are actually handed over, preserved and handed over to the agencies, to the fire, law, and emergency services folks in the jurisdiction that you're working in, and that this can be then used in their evacuation management system. So the data needs to be looked at once again in a regional context. And so by making the information available to the agencies, they can actually put it into the context of the systems that they currently have. We also recommend that the counties themselves review the information and make sure that and understand how it fits into that regional context, and to continue at least on an annual basis reviewing that information. If you look at it on an annual basis, there may be additional changes, there may be learnings. It may turn out that parts of the study made sense and other parts of it did not once the actual event, once the actual subdivision has been put in place. And then finally, the information from this is not just for the first responders. The agencies themselves in the long run also need to publish this information to the communities so they know where are the temporary refuge areas, what are the key routes to get in and out of, and what to do in these situations. So it's mission critical to take the information, the data that's collected, and not just have it sit on the shelf. I'm going to pass it back to you, Kevin.
Okay, well, Charlie, I'm going to hand it right back to you. I have a follow-up question. We're through a formal presentation. And a couple things. One was, we haven't talked about this for a while, but this is on the subject of how many roads you have in and out of a development. And you had talked about redundancy as a concept in this context. Could you please talk about that a little bit more? And then also tell us about what your company is doing for approximately 30 counties around.
Okay, yeah. Well, there's a couple different things. One, there's a couple different types of redundancy. So one is the redundancy that Mike spoke about, which is the redundancy of roads, the ability to have different ways of getting in and out of an area, or having different places that people can go to. There's another type of redundancy, which is a little more subtle, which is the redundancy of having a variety of different agencies and people who have access to the same information and can make the same decisions. If it's, like I said, if it's in a 3-ring binder on somebody's shelf, it makes it very hard for other agencies and other people to participate. So what we've been doing across California, we've got 32 counties right now that are working together on a common platform, is that we've worked with the agencies to define down to an evacuation zone, so a sub area of either a subdivision or a region that has a certain number of population, has a geographic consistency. We look at a variety of different items, and then we have the tools to be able to run fire simulations, do training so that people can actually determine how to get out. So this system can also be used to put in additional address points in an area and be able to determine whether or not it's going to affect the regional context. And so the system's been used on about 200 fires across the US in the last 3 years, including fires like the Dixie Fire, which crossed multiple counties. We often think in the context of a single subdivision in an area when we really have regional players that we need to work with. So, so it's really mission critical that that data becomes part of the public of the permanent record for the agencies, and then there's a common operating picture for law, fire, and emergency services, which is very easy to think about. But the new participant in that common operating picture is the public. How do they know what routes, what shelters or temporary refuge areas they need to go to, which roads are closed, and when they're expected to open?
Very good. Thank you very much. Now, staying with this two road standard, Bob, let me ask you how that fits into our other proposed requirement regarding 1 hour evacuation success.
Okay. Traditionally, some jurisdictions have just come up with that they wanted one or two means of ingress egress for a project, but it wasn't really quantified on what the goal was. So what we did is in this proposed legislation, there's actually criteria, 1 hour criteria to evacuate the area. If it can be done within the 1 hour from one access point, depending upon the project, it may not need a secondary access. If the volume of traffic is so large that it can't be done in 1 hour, maybe it needs 2, maybe it needs 3, maybe it needs 4 points of access. So now what we've done is we've tried to tie it to a time criteria to be able to get the people out, with the exception that's allowed based on the time.
Thank you. Now let me go to Laura. Laura, how does this all sync with the current, as amended, fire safe regs?
Well, I'll start by saying that we chose the area where these requirements apply as the same exact areas, SRA and LRA areas, where the fire safe regs apply, along with the construction requirements and the defensible space requirements. So this just completes the package. So there are no conflicts. Most of those talk about turnarounds. It just didn't talk about evacuation. So we added evacuation so that in these zones, you'll have the full package, how to do vegetation clearance, how to construct structures, and how to evacuate those same areas. So it kind of is the last piece. It's the missing piece.
Thank you. So Mike, let me go to you now. In terms of your experience with projects in, I'll say, Southern California that have ended up in litigation. One of our main goals here is to make a process that people can follow and people aren't fighting over what's an acceptable methodology and what's an acceptable plan. So what kind of optimism do you take to this whole issue of avoiding unnecessary litigation with what we're proposing?
This is a very litigious subject you're talking about, Kevin, as you're fully aware. There isn't a proposed development in California that seems that it isn't being litigated by multiple parties for multiple reasons. The big issue, though, and I'll just talk about San Diego County's experience. I've worked a lot with them. They had 8 planned community developments overturned in the courts in the last few years for various issues associated with faulty EIR assessments as found by the courts. And these were brought primarily by environmental organizations. And what this has caused the county to do is revamp its entire approach to planning to be more inclusive of fire safety and evacuation regulation. Where 10 years ago, the county was probably in the bottom third of agencies promoting those kinds of regulations. I would say they're at the very top in California today and have probably met or exceeded state standards in development practices since. But still, the question of evacuation remains as one without a standard statewide to point to. And this has been contentious as far as the development community saying that San Diego's standards are onerous and that they're the only county in California currently trying to promote an evacuation standard. The county took the unusual step of denying a project, the first one in the board's recent history that they've denied for a planned community development they felt was that was cited within the very high fire hazard severity zone that they felt could not achieve the evacuation standards of the county. That is being litigated currently, and that's about all I can say about that because I think I'm on the, I know I'm on the list for subpoena for that project. But you know, it would very much be helpful to the efforts of those that are trying to achieve effective fire safe planning in California to have a statewide standard that stipulates how and when these projects will have to address these concerns. And there are places, you know, that are going to not be able to meet the standards and will by default fall out of probably a development process as a result. That's a fact. That's my assessment. But on the other hand, it will allow development to be, you know, to proceed in some places where it would not have been safe without these mitigations proposed here. So it will have an impact on the future of development in California, certainly, if this is successful. I think for the most part, it will serve the public's interest well.
Thank you. Bob, let me turn back to you now. Let's assume this legislation is passed. How long will all the various agencies and different associations need to sort of get up to speed on it and start applying it effectively?
But if the legislation is passed, there's usually an implementation date, and that will be part of the legislation. They'll be talking to stakeholders and see, can it start at the first of the year or at a certain date? As far as gearing up, this will be something that it's probably going to take most entities probably 6 months to a year to be able to deal with this. We also will have to look at projects that are already in the pipeline will probably be grandfathered in. They won't be under the new rules. So it's a typical change of all codes and regulations as far as full implementation. But I would say as this is introduced into this legislative session, if it is approved early, it may be able to be enacted by a January 1 date or later on in the calendar year.
Thank you. Charlie, can you please comment on this overriding issue that really goes through most of what we're doing, the need for cooperation and coordination, not only in terms of, you know, data sharing and things like that, but you've seen a whole lot of incidents. Your company helps manage those. And what lessons can you affirm regarding the need for best efforts to have maximally efficient cooperation between law enforcement and fire authorities?
Oh, like I said, we've worked with counties up and down the state, small and large, and we've been on wildfire, tsunami hazard, flood, active shooter type events. And, fundamentally, every one of these events is a multi-agency event. Two things. One, most of these hazards cross multiple jurisdictions, right? So you talked about state responsibility areas, local responsibility areas, federal responsibility areas. I can't think of really one of the larger fires that happened in California recently that didn't cross into multiple areas. Many counties have already got in place evacuation management teams or groups of people that are multi-jurisdictional. So often it's led by the county, but the county also needs to work with some of the larger cities and the cities within the agencies as well. One of the things that may be subtle here, but law enforcement is the one in California that calls for an evacuation. California is unique in the country in the fact that you can order an evacuation. It's called an evacuation order. Many other states, it's a recommendation or it's a suggestion, and it's really not enforceable. But in California, it is enforceable. So law enforcement is responsible for calling for the evacuation, but it's often the fire agencies that are the ones that understand the operational context of the fire, where it's going, and how quickly it's moving. And so it's a true partnership in making decisions on how to get that done. And then a third group in that triangle is the emergency management group. And often the emergency management, Office of Emergency Services, Department of Emergency Management, it's called many different things. They run the mass notification system, right? They're the ones that have the tools to send out the alerts through the FEMA IPAWS system, or send out SMS texts, or call cell phones, or call landlines. And so those folks need to be involved as well. And so what becomes critical is that they're all on the same page and they all have the same common operating picture. So by having things like common zones, common training schedules, and working on cross-agency training scenarios, you really start to drive consistency across the organization. So very simply, if somebody in the field needs to make a decision quickly and they want to evacuate an area, they can say evacuate zone 3, 4, and 5. Instead of trying to describe it by roads, they can use their radio. That information gets back to the emergency management team who's doing the mass notification. They can see the same zones in their application, make a quick decision. And so the key is shortening from what would take, in many cases, a couple hours down to a couple minutes through that interagency collaboration.
Thank you. Laura, let me turn to you. Charlie mentioned this issue of mandatory evacuation orders. And can you talk a little bit about your experience with those types of orders, how often they're followed, and should there be any efforts, and this is going a little bit beyond our proposed legislation, but directly related and related to a couple of key points, but should there be some legislative approach to trying to make mandatory evacuation orders really mandatory?
Well, I'll start with the first part of how often they're followed. And that really probably depends varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And a lot of it has to do with how educated the public is, how well they understand fire behavior, how well they, how connected they are with emergency services. So in our experience, a lot of people felt that they take the freeway fire example in Orange County in 2008, and they really felt like they were safe. They had fuel notification, had just been inspected. It went all the way around the community. And so many of them, when evacuation warning was issued, they stayed in place, they were alert. But then when a mandatory evacuation order was issued, and in California, there's enforcement, like Charlie said, but that's only on coming into an evacuated area, an area under a mandatory evacuation. If you're asking someone to leave, you can't require them to leave. You can't mandate that they leave. So a lot of them stayed in place. And I will tell you, afterwards, we had a town hall meeting and we explained the risks, and some of them experienced that. And many of them felt that the next time that they would leave. And, you know, as fire marshal, take partial responsibility for their lack of education. We hadn't seen that kind of fire behavior before. Fire behavior is much more erratic than it used to be because the winds are stronger, climate, the terrain is drier. So we're seeing very severe wildfire behavior. And a lot of them have told us, we did subsequent workshops, we educated them, we got them to create a fire safe council the next time that they would leave. So one thing I think that they have to be informed of too is during a few of the campaign fires, people are out for days or sometimes even weeks. And it makes it difficult on them. So they say they come back and their house has survived. So then, you know, we've talked about in fire service, how do we get them back in quicker? You know, power, education, or somebody said, I don't remember if this panel or the last one, that knowledge is power. And if they have that knowledge, and they're good decision makers because we worked with them in advance, then maybe there's ways to make it more safe and get them back in quicker with that education so they don't step in a pool that they can't see or on a power line, a down power line. So that's still a pending issue. As far as my opinion on if there should be mandatory, I don't know how it would be enforced. Resources are stretched during one of these events. So I don't know, Bob Roper might have a little bit more on that because he's worked at higher levels of law enforcement, if there would be a way to enforce it, even if it was a law.
Thanks, Laura. Bob, you just were invited into this subject matter.
Okay, Kevin, help me reframe that question.
Basically, there's an issue about people not following evacuation orders. And is there anything else that, you know, we could be doing in order to make that more effective when the orders do come down and to increase the level of expectation as to meaningful compliance?
Okay. You know, the best thing for evacuation compliance is number one, preparation for the community, the city, the county to be able to do the local evacuation planning. And that is being done in a lot of ways now with booklets that are given out to households. There's also the great thing like Charlie's product that actually has a program that somebody can bring up on their iPad, on their phone themselves to be able to see what's happening. What we try to do is we recognize that no matter what we do for a new project, we try to get everybody out of it, but we can never outguess where the exact ignition source and where the wildland fire starts. It may cut off the access points. That's why it's important for us to have safe havens and temporary refuge areas built into the community so that people have somewhere to go and protect themselves. Also, like Laura talked about with the Ready, Set, Go program, we identified clearly that a lot of people perish because they evacuate too late and they get caught on roads with smoke, occlusion, and so forth, and they die from vehicle accidents and not from the fire. So the best thing we can get people to do is, number one, is to understand that they live in a hazardous area. Number two is get educated about their surroundings, understand what wildfires are, raise their situational awareness, and then work with their local community on how best they're going to receive the evacuation notice, whether that's from some communities have sirens, others will have automated programs. And what we try to tell people is, remember, every car radio still has an AM radio station, and those were designed to be able to get those emergency alerts out.
Good to know. Mike Rohde, let me ask you about this general subject of preparation. What do you think about evacuation practices in communities in these areas?
We've actually had some success with voluntary participation in these kinds of exercises in a couple of communities where we sponsored a practice day. In that case, the community at risk practices a notification and movement along evacuation routes that are, and it's usually the culmination of community's effort to develop new planning and new notification systems and to test these systems out. And it's a good way, I think, to culminate those kinds of activities within the community and to inform residents on their successes and to make them aware of those processes. Evacuation fatigue has become a real problem in communities that have repetitive exposure to wildfire. We've been lucky in a lot of places to have success. Those messages that Bob and Laura talked about, and working with the public groups and keeping those elements fresh is an important challenge for the public safety agencies and their cooperators to engage in, to make the public aware and refresh those thoughts, I think, for the community.
Well, so what about the idea of some level of statewide standard or recommended criteria for when you do have regular evacuation practice?
I think the best results have come after a culmination of investment and time to upgrade older or existing plans and to keep those fresh in the public's mind and to show and demonstrate how these processes change over time. I don't think any evacuation plan is one and done for 50 years. They change over time, and folks tend to forget about those things between the first and the last emergency. I don't know if regulating that practice is the best way to go, but certainly engagement with the public and cooperating agencies and partners to get the refreshed messages out is important, I think, Kevin.
Thank you. I would add at this point that I was involved a few years ago in negotiating a deal with a developer that was proposing to put in 110 homes basically adjacent to Chino Hills State Park. And the name of the development at the time was Cielo Vista. It's being built now. But what we negotiated was a series of measures to ensure preparation of residents when a wildfire came. And we started with funding, and we negotiated a mandatory requirement for a portion of regular homeowners association fees being set aside for wildfire education and evacuation practices. So this is actually a deal. We have the contract, and we're watching them right now as they're building the project and planning on watching how the agreement is implemented. But it takes money in these contexts often to keep people educated and to keep them up to date. In other words, the public agencies can only do so much. And the basic assumption is that the HOA really needs to take responsibility to keep people up to date on things and literally to have annual evacuation practices. So we were very excited about that deal, and we're looking to see how that works out. And if nothing else, if you get people out of their homes once a year and practice, this is going to be on their mind, and they're going to know where to go and in an emergency, which will help save lives. So let me ask Laura to talk further or provide us some details regarding the work you do on the Fire Safe Council. You and Bob are both on that. That's a statewide nonprofit. I know it's doing really important work, including issues like education and such. So can you give us a little bit more detail about what you guys are doing there?
Sure. It's a really exciting piece of the wildfire problem. When we were talking about knowledge being power, it's amazing what happens when you get a group of homeowners together and that live in one of these wildfire hazard areas, and explain to them their risk, even show them their risk. Mike talked about fire modeling, and on a cursory level, it's pretty easy to do to find out how fire enters a community, and most of them already know. And then you tell them exactly what the risk is based on the construction of their homes. There's a lot of agencies now that will go out and do a home and yard assessment, a defensible space assessment for free. In these zones, you're already required to have defensible space. Right now, there's a lot of people working on how do we harden homes retroactively, which is a little bit more difficult, but they're looking at low cost options for that too. But once we empower these homeowners with knowledge, then they really do, they start to own the risk, and they say, well, we don't want our community and our neighbors to be in peril. So they start on an effort to make their communities more resilient to wildfire. And so our goal is to support that effort, to provide the information, sometimes legislation if we can. We also are a grants clearinghouse. So we get grants from the U.S. Forest Service, sometimes the utilities, and we pass through CAL FIRE, and we give them the money and the support that they need to take it on themselves. And many of them, sometimes there are evacuation. I just reviewed the last batch of grant applications that came through, and many of them are asking for funding for evacuation planning and putting up the signs and holding drills. So it's empowering the grassroots effort to tackle the wildfire problem.
So now there are local fire safe councils. I know that, again, in this deal we negotiated with the developer near Chino Hills State Park, we actually required them to, once they got to a certain point in the building of the project, that they took steps to establish a local fire safe council. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with the local chapters, so to speak?
Sure. And that's who we serve. I will say that there are also similar organizations that just don't have that title. It could be a resource conservation group. NFPA has the National Fire Protection Association has a program called FireWise. But basically you get together and say, we as a community want to do something to protect ourselves. And whether it's whatever name it has, as long as they're working with a 501c3 that can receive the funding, then they're the ones that make it happen. We just are there, we facilitate it, we support them, we help them through the CEQA process. So we try to enable them to do the work that they have identified. Most of them create a community wildfire protection plan that looks at all of the risks, prioritizes them, and develops projects to address all of the risks. So a lot of them are very sophisticated. There are other ones that are just starting up. And so we're there mostly to support them.
So I have a question for the group now along this line. People have heard generally about insurance companies not being interested in insuring people in these high risk areas. In fact, I think there's somewhat of a trend going on there. And has anybody seen or heard of any evidence where insurance companies are interested and in fact supportive of these fire safe council type goals for a community, such that it would become potentially an underwriting factor when they're deciding whether or not they're going to insure homes in a particular development? So that's an open question.
Okay. Well, Kevin, I'll take the first stab at it.
Okay, thanks, Bob.
There are several companies out there, one being USAA, that is giving a like a 5% discount to communities that are, we'll call them FireWise communities. Okay. There's more and more insurance companies that are recognizing the benefits of FireWise communities, FireWise, and so forth, and the attributes that they provide. There isn't anything yet to where it's being mandated that a community or a parcel has to be part of one of these. But this is an emerging market, an emerging trend that's out there. And so that may be one of the outfalls of this in the future.
Anybody want to add anything on that point? All right, well, let me ask you another question. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm just going to suggest that many insurance providers, as you're probably aware, have left the state of California and will no longer write fire policies for homeowners in the state as a result of losses in the last several years. And those that still have insurance, Laguna Beach is a great example of, have seen their insurance rates climb by 200% and 300% in order to maintain their old policies, or have moved to the state's assigned risk fair plan type of policies that don't offer full coverage in order to maintain some semblance of fire insurance. So it's a real need to continue to work with the insurance industry to have them move to a new understanding of what is a fire safe home in California. They still use the old actuarials and the old standards they have for the last couple of decades. And things have changed in the fire safe picture in California and what can be done. And we'd like to see the insurance companies do more in recognition of that.
So then, seems to me that these companies would also be interested in knowing whether there's a meaningful evacuation plan in place for the community that they may be insuring.
I believe that would be a good outcome, Kevin.
Okay. Well, that was a big softball for you there, Mike. Do you have anything else to say? Let me go to Charlie. What do you think about that, Charlie?
Well, I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time with insurance, but what I will say is that they're interested in protecting the structures, right? So that's where so if you're doing fuels mitigation and such around the community, then that's really the focus for them. We're actually seeing a lot of private fire agencies that are coming in that are hired by the insurance companies to actually come in and foam a house right prior, if something's coming, because the goal is really to protect the structure. So the stuff that we were talking, I think Leslie was talking about around the mitigation planning and the fire safe councils and the HOAs focused on that. That's key, the fire breaks, and the fuels reduction.
So it's a very interesting point you raise, because and I should disclose, Mike was talking about litigation in San Diego County. I've been involved in a fair amount of it, which allowed me to have a good bargaining position with the developer up in Orange County on this contract we negotiated in terms of funding for evacuation efforts and all that. And what I've seen over and over again in the court setting and in the public hearing setting that precedes it is the developers want to talk about protecting the structures. And often the citizens are saying, well, what about us, kind of thing. And so going back to this example regarding Paradise and the number of people that died up there, I mean, there's big money in that in terms of losses, tragic losses. So the insurers have to be concerned to some extent about personal injury damages when they're looking at these areas. So let me just throw that question out to everybody. Does anybody want to weigh in on that? Not that you're insurance agents, but just in terms of your experience and, this world we're dealing in.
I'll take a fifth on that one.
I just stumped the panel. Okay, very good. So now let me ask about this. And Bob, I'd like to go back to what was one of your original points when we started this effort, and the need for making sure there's efficient coordination with the different agencies. Can you give us some examples, maybe without naming names, where lack of coordination, particularly on the ground, just really did not end well?
Primarily, it's been on the scene of the emergency is law enforcement has the jurisdictional responsibility to do evacuations, but it's the fire agencies that actually identify this is a hazard, this is where the fire is going to be in so much time, this is the area that we need evacuated. They give that direction to law enforcement. The problem has been sometimes in the past is law enforcement agencies don't always have the same mutual aid relationship that fire agencies do. So they're now trying to evacuate an area, trying to get additional resources in to get it done. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Probably as we talk about evacuations, the other topic that we should also touch base on is the re-entry issues. And what that means is soon as before we order an evacuation, we in the emergency response arena, we also begin to think about re-entry criteria. How do we remove the hazard so it's safe for somebody to return? Because naturally, number one, people want to know, did they suffer a loss? Number two, a lot of people have animals, they left their medications behind or something, they want to return. And so we try to take the reentry criteria at the same time as we deal with the evacuation criteria. And that is always a work of art to figure out because there's no full criteria. It's easier to do an evacuation than it actually is to get people returned.
Interesting.
It's important, I think, Kevin, to state that there's still a matter of personal responsibility for homeowners in the wildland urban interface to both make their home as fire resistant as possible and to prepare their own evacuation plans and to be ready to move when public officials ask, because I don't think people still understand the position the public safety responders find themselves in during the early hours of a wildfire emergency in California. Frequently, these fires are not singular events. They're happening in concert with a number of fires regionally in a regional emerging disaster. And statistically, most fires in California, the structural loss has occurred and is over within the first 12 hours of the fire's occurrence. Now, in California, we're blessed to have the strongest mutual aid system for fire resources in the country. And by tomorrow, I can have a parking lot with 200 fire trucks sitting in it and a great photo of how that system works. But that's tomorrow. In that first 12 hours, amongst all those other fires, trying to get resources mustered and to the point of implementing action on the fire ground, you're pretty much challenged to make that happen in the midst of evacuations and everything else. If homeowners haven't taken steps to improve the fire resiliency of their own home, they can't ask public safety folks to do miracles. And the same is true in evacuations. They have to have their own plan for how they're going to implement an evacuation, and where they're going to meet up, how they're going to arrange for their children. They should not be in the mood that they're going to rely entirely on public safety officials to deliver their needs in this case.
So that point is I think, well addressed in what we're proposing when we require that the environmental documentation and the evacuation plan itself clearly explain the roles of law enforcement and the fire authority, particularly in the event of multi-fire events. So this is part of the education that we want to accomplish here, is people have to understand that there are limitations as to what can be done. And they do need to take, some responsibility, but they need to have the explanations in front of them, publicly available so they know the facts. Now, one of the problems that I've seen over and over again over the years is that the developers and some, and the city people supporting the project will bring in fire authorities, and they'll stand up there and they're expected to say the project is safe. And, basically they'll say, well, we've gone through our review, which, is limited when you're talking about all the issues associated with proposing a development in one of these risk areas. And the public takes that and says, and particularly the decision makers, which gets really frustrating, where the decision makers say, well, the fire people say it's fine, so it's safe, so I'm voting for it. And they don't want to hear anything else other than that the fire people say it's safe. So that is one of the things that I really wanted to address with this legislation, making sure that that wasn't being done in a way that the public was then just going on their merry way and not thinking about it until the fire comes. So now, Bob, you and I have talked about this issue before in terms of the level of public, knowledge and all, and comments on this in terms of making sure that the process is done in a way where people really are properly educated from the beginning.
Yeah. One thing I'll just tell you in my experience, people will go to their local fire station and say, hey, here's the project, this is what I want. And the guys at the fire station says, hey, it sounds good to me. And that's not the official position of the organization, because a lot of times they're not looking at the larger picture, other developments around it and so forth. So number one, it needs to go through the respective agencies, fire marshal, and inclusive of the fire chief. What we end up having to do is we get into those political situations, depending upon the type of jurisdiction it's in, the politics, where even fire chiefs, police chiefs, and sheriffs are influenced by the political wills at hand. What we try to do is, through this type of legislation, try to put some meaningful criteria in there, because in the past, a lot of the information has been arbitrary at best. And so with definitive information, milestones that have to be accomplished and stuff in the CEQA process, we believe that this type of legislation will be meaningful and will remove it from the political fray of things, hopefully. And it will also allow project decisions to be made on a timely basis.
Thanks, Bob. I note here a comment I would commend everyone's attention by Margie Kay. And she's recommending having a list of what to take and to have in a bag packed with clothes and toiletries when fire season begins. So I'm assuming everybody would endorse that as good advice. Good psychological preparation also, I would imagine. So let me ask you this. One of the things that we want done here is we want the evacuation plan preparation to inform the design of the project, rather than somebody coming forward and saying, here's the project, we're going to have one road, now let's find a way to rationalize an evacuation plan. So let me ask Mike to comment on that particular issue and how important it is not to have the tail wagging the dog.
Many communities, struggle with the same questions you brought forward, Kevin. What is reasonable advice? And by the way, everybody brings an expert to the table. They hire one of one kind or another, and you can get a variety of opinion. And having a state standard that says that you'll have 2 ways in and out, having a state standard says that you'll plan for evacuation and you'll use certified traffic engineers and fire history and behavior as a guidance factor of how that's done. That's great guidance, I think, for how that process should be accomplished. And it's going to benefit and inform decision makers throughout the state. That's the benefit of this legislation. And it established some kind of standard or benchmark what is reasonable and fair and just and important. Right now, I can show you a series of development plans that have a wide variety of expertise and technologies applied to answering the questions that are all the roads sufficient or are the fire behavior impacts acceptable. And some of this stuff comes out of the blue. There's people that have no standing or professional experience in this that are quite frankly providing advice. And I think that providing the right tools to decision makers here is going to go a long ways in improving that process.
Thank you. So we have a few more minutes left. What I'd like to do is taking you as our foundation as sort of summary comments here, go around the room, so to speak, here in terms of concluding statements regarding the hopes for this legislation. So let me go to Charlie right now and ask you to take a minute or so to comment on that.
Thank you. I think our main hope is that, ultimately we end up with incredibly safe and well-informed public through the process, so that the work that's done during these development and the analyses are shared. And that from the beginning, we think from a cross-agency approach, and that it's a partnership. It's a partnership with the developer, and that they think about this from the beginning. It just seems that we tend to get adversarial fairly quickly. So if we can remove the, if we can apply consistency and standards, then I think we'll end up really helping drive that. So thinking about regional context and not just the local context. So at Genesis, we're providing the tool to allow people to manage the evacuations and send out the alerts, and then also do the outdoor warning. And so being able to really think about that plan from the beginning through the process, so that safety is a key part of the development is mission critical.
Thank you. Laura?
I would say that having the legislation in place that compels evacuation planning is going to complete the picture, for one, in the fire safe regs and construction standards and defensible space. And I think just as importantly, it will also be a tool that kind of brings communities together. So just like we find with the Fire Safe Council when they're working with each other to build resilience into the community as a whole, it's neighbor helping neighbor. They know where their vulnerable populations live in their neighborhood. And, that could be an unintended, really good result of this legislation, in addition to just keeping people safe by letting them know what to do if there is a wildfire in their community, how to get out.
Thank you. Okay. And Bob?
The legislation, I think, is key for new developments. And what I want to do is just point out to everybody, similar to new codes and the fire safe regulations are great for new development, our ongoing challenge is that is a minority of the issue, the problem. What we still have to try to tackle is how do we deal with the existing inventory of structures out there, the existing communities out there, and this legislation will address how do we deal with new developments, but we still have to work collectively together on how do we deal with evacuations as a whole community.
All right, well, thank you very much. So I'm going to turn this back to Howard in just a moment. I just want to thank everybody for the panel today and for our journey together the last 3 months on developing this proposed legislation. I want to thank Matt Baker, again, the policy director for PCL, for being part of that process. And at PCL, we're all very excited about the next steps here in terms of hopefully having a bill introduced and moving this forward. So thank you again, everybody. Your years of experience are impressive, inspiring, and I think bearing fruit here in terms of this effort. So thanks very much. And Howard, back to you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate it. Laura, Michael, Charlie, Bob, thanks so much for participating today. Kevin, for organizing and moderating this panel. Really appreciate your time. I also wanted to thank this team for all the work and efforts on this legislative proposal. It takes a smart, expert team like this to come up with creative solutions to our planning processes and evacuation needs. And this is often what we do with many of these topics across the kind of PCL spectrum, is to reach out and involve these type of industry and topic specific experts. So thank you so much for your work the last several months. Thanks everyone for joining us today in the second session. Again, you can find the videos, presentations, comments, and the questions that were raised all on our sessions information at pcl.org/registrant-info. Johnny, you can put that in the chat box again for people that are joining us and haven't seen it before. And thanks everyone for joining us on our second session. Our next session, AB 2438 and beyond, bringing California's transportation spending into alignment with our climate and equity goals. We'll get started here at 12:30. So just in about, 10 minutes or so, 12 minutes? Yeah, 8 minutes, see there. And we'll see everyone in a few minutes to get started on our third session of the day. Thanks, and we'll be back with you in just a little bit.